Hey guys, this is Supernova reading through How Do We Know the Bible is True, Volume 1, co-edited by Ken Ham and Bodie Hodge. And I'm an atheist giving you an atheist perspective on this, specifically in this video on Chapter 22. Are there contradictions in the Bible? Of course there are. Subscribe, be sure to comment, share if you like, and I will catch you next time. No, I'm just kidding, of course. And you can tell just by looking at the length of this video, which is suspiciously long for one single chapter. But I want to give this a very in-depth treatment. I want to nail this one because, as the author will go on to say, this is the easiest way to disprove that the Bible is entirely true. Even one contradiction will do it. And I've presented contradictions in the past, and I will present some more here. I want to nail this subject down. I want to give you something that you can go to Christians with and have them going, because I have, and I know some good contradictions that you can pass on. But seriously, there are plenty of contradictions. If you go to www.skepticsannotatedbible.com, you can find. If you click on any book, you can see there's a little legend on the side that gives you all the different things they found. And one of them is contradictions, and you can click that, and you'll get a list of all the contradictions as well as links to every single one, so you can actually go check it out for yourself. There are plenty of contradictions, and Christians would agree with that if the bias was taken away, and I will attempt to prove that here in a very clever way, I think. So anyway, the author of this chapter is Jason Leisel, who I have pointed out in the past is a real scientist. He's an astrophysicist and a pretty smart guy. He's very logical. He understands logic, although he misapplies it because of his bias, which is the big problem here. And he'll actually give a good defense of this. He'll point out many ways that you could shoot down contradictions, some ways to point out false contradictions, but of course they're not evenly applied because of bias. So anyway, let's begin. You can't trust the Bible. It's full of contradictions. It is a popular view these days. Many people have the impression that the Bible is simply an outdated book of fairy tales and contradictions. Why pair fairy tales and contradictions? Let's go on to the next paragraph. After all, the Bible speaks of floating axe heads, the sun apparently going backward, a universe created in 6 days, an earth that has pillars and corners, people walking on water, light before the sun, a talking snake, a talking donkey, dragons, and a senior citizen taking 2 of every animal on a big boat. On the surface, these things may seem absurd, particularly to those unfamiliar with the Christian worldview, but to make matters even worse, it is alleged that the Bible contains contradictions. What does any of that have to do with contradictions? It's a list of absurdities, things that don't seem to conform to our knowledge of nature, but they're not contradictions. It's like if you watch a sci-fi movie or a fantasy movie, you might believe that they're absurd. I mean, that's the whole point. That's what makes them sci-fi or fantasy. You might think, well, this never happened and it never could happen, but it's not necessarily contradictory. I mean, they're talking about an alternate universe with its own rules and things. Just so long as they don't break their own rules they set up, there's no contradiction there. Absurdities and contradictions are 2 different things. But he's trying to make an ad hominem argument against skeptics. He's trying to make it sound like, oh, they can't get over the idea that there are so many absurd things in the Bible that they have to believe that there are contradictions as well, which is a really silly thing to say. But the next section is called Logical versus Psychological Problems, where he goes into this even further. If the Bible is true, it's certainly not a problem for an all-powerful God to make the sun go backward, to walk on water, to make a donkey talk, or to raise the dead. These things may seem counterintuitive, but they are not illogical. They are merely a psychological problem for some. There's nothing illogical about an all-powerful God doing just that. To argue that something is impossible, make it seem counterintuitive. That's not rational. Now, there are 2 different types of contradictions. There's contradictions where the Bible says one thing in one section, says something in another, and those 2 are A and not A. They're mutually exclusive. They can't both be true. That's a contradiction. There are also contradictions where the Bible contradicts science, things that we have evidence for or things that we know happen. And it's not necessarily against scientific processes. I mean, a listing of a miracle such as Jesus walking on water isn't a contradiction, even though that would constitute an absurdity. It's merely a contradiction if, for instance, we should have evidence of Jesus walking on water that we don't have, or we have evidence that shows that Jesus couldn't have walked on water. That would be a contradiction. But nonetheless, he wants to paint us with this absurdity stroke, saying, oh, they all believe in absurdities, so they also believe in contradictions. No, we found some logical ones, obvious logical ones. The challenge of contradictions. What constitutes a contradiction? Most alleged Bible contradictions are not even apparent contradictions because there's no necessary conflict between two propositions. For example, the statements Jesus is descended from Adam and Jesus is descended from Noah are not contradictory since both are true. Yeah, no kidding. I don't think anybody has ever pointed that out as a contradiction. Like I said in the last video, he's going to pick some low-hanging fruit. Yes, I know the actual phrase. I just had a brain cramp there. He's going to attack a lot of contradictions that skeptics have not presented and would not present because he can't take on real contradictions. Yes, he does take on some real contradictions, but whenever he can, he posits these really poor examples. I wish he had gone to like skepticsantebible.com and taken some of those. At least those I think we would accept our crowdsource, the things that atheists actually point out. But no kidding. Difference of sense or relationship. Since words can be used in different senses, it is possible to have A and not A at the same time as long as the relationship or sense of the word is different. A man can be a bachelor and also married in the sense that he is married to his job. So yes, you could equivocate something and not even necessarily be equivocating the term, but just using it in a different sense. And generally you can tell that by context. Romans 4:2-3 teaches that Abraham was justified by faith alone, not by works. Yes, if you look up Romans 4:2-3, a whole book of Romans is about how faith is more important than works. It says, yes, you've got to have works too, but works won't get you salvation. However, James 2:21-24 teaches that Abraham was justified by works and not by faith alone. Do we have a contradiction here? We do have A and not A at the same time, but the relationship differs. Romans 4 is teaching about justification before God. By faith alone, Abraham was considered righteous before God. But James 2 is teaching about justification before men. By works, as a result of faith, Abraham was considered righteous before men. There's no contradiction here. That's clearly not true. He cites James 2:18, which talks about doing works before men, but it's a different context. When he's talking about Abraham, he's talking about how Abraham's works were what actually showed his faith, what actually made it real. As the old Rich Mullins song goes, faith without works it just ain't happening. It's like a screen door on a submarine. Don't claim to walk on water. You've got to leap up off the boat before you claim to walk on water. This is quite logical. It's fair for James 2 to make this claim, and it only makes sense. The claim being made in James 2 is about Abraham sacrificing his son, which obviously wasn't done before men. As far as anybody knows, it was a private act. There was no audience. It doesn't make sense for him to be justified before men by doing that. But nonetheless, Jason Leisel is the one equivocating here, not the Bible. Along the same lines, the Trinity is sometimes alleged to be a contradictory concept. How can God be both one and three? We've already covered the Trinity. I don't want to cover it too much here, except to say that again, Jason Leisel he's changing the definition just so that it's not contradictory. He says that it's God in one sense and three in a different sense, one nature and three persons, which seems to suggest that when you call them one God, you're just talking about them agreeing, of being of one mind, rather than what I hear from Christians all the time, that he's both one person and three persons, which would be the miracle that they imply the Trinity to be, not just a concept of Christianity, as Jason Leisel seems to make it here. False dilemma. Some alleged contradictions of the Bible are presented as a dilemma. Was the Bible given by inspiration of God as indicated in 2 Timothy 3:16, or was it written by men as indicated in other passages? Again, I don't know of anybody who's ever made this argument. It's trying to, yes, you shouldn't make a false dilemma out of that. It could be both, but again, who's claiming that it's either? Just a bad example. Contextual considerations. Some example of alleged contradictions commit the fallacy of taking the text out of context. For example, Genesis 1 indicates that God exists and has made everything. Suppose someone argued that this contradicts Psalm 14:1, in which we read, "There is no God." But if we see the whole verse, it says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." This has already been treated elsewhere in the context. I imagine that there are atheists that quote mine because there are irrational atheists. I would say most atheists are irrational because most people are irrational. But quote mining typically isn't something that atheists do. They don't see much value in it. I see this a lot from Christians. So yes, of course, you could take something out of context to make it appear to be a contradiction. But that's why we have things like the Skeptic's Annotated Bible, where you can see the context. It cites it as an annotation next to the verse, so you can actually read it in context. Fallacy of sweeping generalization. There's a number of places where the Bible speaks in terms of generalizations, things that are usually but not universally true. The book of Proverbs contains many of these. It is not a contradiction to have some instances where the general rule does not apply. Therefore, we must not be careful not to commit the fallacy of a sweeping generalization, applying a general principle as if it were a universal rule. The Proverbs are not intended to be taken as universal rules, but rather as general principles that work most of the time. I don't understand why he picks that out. Nobody has argued that Proverbs are universal rules. Not even, well, atheists haven't, but I believe Christians do because it's still in the Bible. It's still scripture. Why would you treat Proverbs with a double standard? But I don't see why you would argue that it wouldn't be. Moreover, the Bible also contains things that are indeed rules but have acceptable exemptions. Clearly, the Bible teaches it's wrong to kill and yet understandably makes exceptions for self-defense, punishment for certain crimes, and during battle. Which is why skeptics point out things like the taking of the city of Jericho, where not only the men of battle were killed, but also women and children and livestock. There were none left alive. That would be murder. That's not an exception. Clearly not. If it happened nowadays, you would be against it, Christians. Translational issues. Another difficulty arises due to the fact that most of us read the Bible in a different language than the original. This allows for the possibility of translational issues. I'm not going to go over his contradiction because it's silly. It's the Peter replying 3 times back to Jesus when Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" And he says, Jesus asks if he loves him in 3 different ways, which is why it's not absurd for Jesus to ask the same question 3 times. But again, this isn't a contradiction. This isn't even a logical contradiction that somebody could attack. It's such a silly thing to bring up. But a better example would be all those cases where numbers are different, such as between 2nd Chronicles and 2nd Kings, where you have different kings having different ages and different lengths of reign. Those would be clear contradictions, and those would be things that Christians would claim are transcription errors from just the copying over. Because he claims the informed Christian does not claim that a miscopying of Scripture contains no errors, only that the original manuscripts contain none, since they were divinely inspired. Do Christians give this benefit of the doubt to all the other holy books? I'm going to show you that they don't. But clearly this is something that can't be proven anyway. We don't have the original manuscripts. We never did. We probably never will. There's no way to check that the originals don't have errors. But older manuscripts that we can check, I pointed out, for instance, in 2nd Kings, there's an issue that's just a few verses away from where it's earlier put, where a king only had a reign for 16 years, and then we were told that in the 20th year of his reign something happened. That is a book that's supposedly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, one that's supposedly accurate and has been shown that it's kept its accuracy. So as far as we have evidence for, these translational issues don't exist. He just liked them to exist. Contradictions of inference. This is an interesting one. Nor are contradictions of inference a genuine problem for the Christian worldview. A contradiction of inference is where we merely infer a contradiction that the text does not actually state. As one example, we might ask, where did Mary and Joseph take Jesus after Bethlehem? Matthew 2:13-15 indicates that they went to Egypt to be safe from King Herod. However, Luke 2:22 and 39 indicates that they took the child to Jerusalem, only a few miles from Bethlehem, and then to Nazareth. There's no mention of Egypt in Luke's account. Is this a contradiction? Although he might infer that both Matthew and Luke are describing the same time period and same visit to the Bethlehem region, the text does not actually state this. Perhaps Matthew is describing a second journey to Bethlehem. In fact, the visit of the wise men may have been as much as 2 years after the birth of Christ. So it may be that Joseph and his family went to Nazareth a few months after the birth of Christ in Bethlehem and then to Egypt after the second trip to the Bethlehem region. Now, the reason that we might see this as a contradiction, yes, we do see this as a genuine contradiction, is because it doesn't make any sense for this to be left out of either story. Why are they telling two different stories? If you believe, as Jason Leisel apparently does, that this is a perfect book, that this is the perfect work of a perfect creator, why are there two different accounts? Why is the same source telling the same story two different ways, inspiring two different accounts of the same story? If there is a best way, a perfect way to tell it, only one of these accounts can be that way. It's either a wise idea to mention the flight to Egypt or it's not. It's either perfect to mention it or it's not. You can't have both different stories being the best story, the perfect way to tell it. There's nothing within the theory of divine inspiration that accounts for things being left out of a story and needing to hear another story just so you can figure out how the story went. That's not even good storytelling. He gives another example of this, another contradiction of inference. This is what we might call the X and only X fallacy. This occurs when a reader erroneously assumes that a number stated in the Bible indicates only X and not more. As an example, consider the account of the demon-possessed man recorded in Mark 5:2-16 and Luke 8:26-37. According to Matthew 8:28-34, there were two men who were demon-possessed. Does this conflict with Mark and Luke, which says that there's only one? We might be inclined to infer from Mark and Luke that there was only one man, but the text does not actually say this. But it doesn't say at least one man, and Matthew doesn't say as much as two men. Yes, to say one man in one account and two men in another account is a contradiction. And I'm going to show this with an unbiased view of how we might figure out whether information is contradictory. Consider this riddle. A teacher's teaching class when 4 students come in late and they say, "Sorry, our car got a flat tire." How does the teacher tell if they're lying? Well, the answer to the riddle is that he takes them into 4 separate rooms and asks them one simple question. Which tire was it? Now, the only way that they could all come up with the same answer is if they at least got their story straight. They talked about it before they came into the classroom, or if it actually happened, because they would be basing on truth. So either way, they're coming from it at the same source if they all have the same story. It's either from the true fact or they were at least smart enough to make sure that they were working from the same story. If they come up with different accounts, such as one says it was one back tire and another says it was both back tires and one says it was a front tire and the fourth one says it was both front tires, we would know that they were lying. We wouldn't have any reason to think, oh, well, they must all be telling the truth for some reason, and it was all 4 tires, and they all just decided to focus on a specific tire or tires. That's clearly not the way it works. Otherwise, why bother to ask them at all if you're going to automatically assume that their stories must fit? This is analogous to a contradiction in the Bible. If you look at the resurrection accounts, in Matthew 28, we have well, all of these resurrection accounts have all kinds of errors, but the one we're going to focus on are the angels that meet the women at the tomb. When the women first appear, the stone is in front of the tomb, but there's an earthquake and it's rolled away and an angel sits on top of it. So in the account in Matthew 28, we have one angel sitting on top of the tombstone. It doesn't mention the women going into the tomb. Why would they? The angel says he's not here, and so they leave. In the account in Mark chapter 16, we have the women arrive at the tomb and they're arguing, how are we going to move the tombstone away? And they find that it's already moved away. And then they go inside and they see one angel sitting there. I think it says at the head of the tomb or something. Whatever. He's not sitting on the rock outside the tomb. He's not outside the tomb at all. It makes it very clear that the women go inside the tomb and then discover an angel sitting there. So in this case, there's still only one angel, and it's just sitting there. And I also ought to point out at this point, it doesn't say angel. It says a man clothed in a long white robe. I think it's inferring that it's an angel. And this is a fair use of Jason Leisel's inference. Now, while it doesn't necessarily say an angel, it actually says man clothed in white. It seems to be implying that it's an angel. There doesn't seem to be any other reference point, any good alternative theory. And so it seems that the author is implying that. And if he's implying that, it's fair to infer that. But nonetheless, he's telling a different story than the person Matthew. When we go over to Luke, we see that the women go into the tomb and find nothing there. And then as they're looking about, two men just kind of show up. And it's not clear whether they're inside the tomb or outside the tomb, but it is clear that they're standing. When they're spotted, they're found standing there, and they just kind of suddenly appear. So they're not sitting on a rock. They're not sitting at the head of the tomb. They're standing in their midst, and they tell them the same story and send them on their way. In the Gospel of John, which is always the weird one, the outcast, the black sheep of the Gospels, the women appear with two disciples, and they go into the tomb and find the cloth that Jesus was supposedly in, and it was empty. And one of the disciples runs away to go tell the others. And Mary Magdalene, it says, looks inside the tomb. She stoops down and looks inside, and there sees two angels sitting there, one at the head and one at the foot. So now there are two that are sitting there that she encounters all by herself inside the tomb, sitting at both the head and the foot. So we have clearly contradictory stories. We have one angel that's sitting on the rock and one that's sitting inside the tomb. Then we have two that just kind of appear and they're standing in their midst, and then two that are encountered sitting inside the tomb. These are four completely different stories. There's no overlap here. It's not like there's 8 angels and you know, they're all met at various places, and it wouldn't make much sense because all the angels have the same message. They say, he is not here. Why would the women hear that outside the tomb and then go inside the tomb to hear it again, and then meet them in another location to hear it again? It doesn't make any sense. Excuse me, I'm talking awfully fast, so it's killing my throat. So this is a clear contradiction, and practically anything in those same stories is. I mean, in one case we have both Marys in Matthew showing up, and then it says both Marys and Salome showing up in Mark, and then in Luke 24 we have both Marys, Mary the mother of James, Mary Magdalene, and Joanna, and other women showing up, and then in John, always the weird one, we have disciples showing up with Mary Magdalene, and maybe it mentions the other Mary too, but I don't think so. And while somebody may say, well, Luke says that it was these 3 women and others, again, that only incorporates the other stories into that one. But when we're talking about the 2 Marys in Matthew, it doesn't say and others. It doesn't say both Marys and Salome and others. Those ones don't make sense of the other stories, and there's no reason to not include them, since obviously the Bible could say and others. Just that one little phrase would make them so that they didn't necessarily contradict. So clearly he doesn't use this context of inference in all cases, and we'll go over that again in just a moment with my clever little bit about showing their bias. Factual contradictions and begging the question. Another type of criticism might be called an apparent factual contradiction. This is the other one that I was talking about, where it seems to contradict science, such as the Earth standing still when supposedly the sun moves backwards. The sun moving doesn't have anything to do with the sun being in our sky. It would have to be the planet that would move backwards, and that just doesn't make any sense. If we stop moving, whatever holds everything onto the planet centrifugal or centrifugal force, whichever. They sound so like they're easy to confuse. Whichever one holds everything onto the planet would let go. We'd lose gravity. We'd lose our atmosphere if the planet stopped. That clearly didn't happen. That's a scientific contradiction. We can include others such as the lack of Big Bang or evolution included. And he claims that, again, that the problem is that secular beliefs are wrong and they contradict the Bible, but it calls this the fallacy of begging the question. And it's only begging the question if we assume that the Bible is wrong because if we assume that these things are true because the Bible is wrong, because that would be the conclusion. If we say, well, the Bible's wrong about creation, that's why evolution is true, thus the Bible is wrong, that's begging the question, but we obviously don't do that. That's silly. Law of non-contradiction, a problem for the non-Christian. Here we go again. He claims that only if the Bible is true would contradictions be unacceptable. Most people simply assume the law of non-contradiction. They take it for granted that a contradiction cannot be true. But have you ever stopped to think about why a contradiction cannot be true? Yeah, it's not true by definition. We don't have to have a foundation. He keeps going on to make these claims that since the things like non-contradictions are founded on the Bible simply by the fact that they are in the Bible, that this must make them all based on biblical principles. But I don't see where he's coming from with this. If we look at a literal foundation, like the cement foundation of a house, we don't have to find wood in it to believe that the house has wood. We don't have to find any cement in the house just because there's cement in the foundation. The foundation can be different from the house. And I'm not trying to reify things here. I'm just trying to give you an idea that it doesn't make any sense to believe it's just because something is based on a foundation, it has to contain the thing that is in the foundation. It's a logical fallacy, in fact. It's the fallacy of composition and the fallacy of division to believe that the whole has to have the traits of all of its parts, or that the parts have to have traits of the whole. That's what he's trying to argue for. It's just a logical fallacy. But nonetheless, he has to beg the contradiction in order to prove that the Bible is what sets up this foundation of non-contradiction, because he has to cite the Bible in order to do so. Conclusion. In this chapter, we've seen many criticisms of the Bible are not even alleged contradictions, but mere opinions about what is possible. These are not logical contradictions for the Bible, it's simply psychological problems for the critic. And he simply just rehashes everything that he's gone through here. Now, why do I believe that this is all bogus? Well, because we have another example in this same book a couple chapters ago, what I covered in the last video. Do you remember this? I didn't go over it, but I'm going to go over it now. We're talking about the proto-evangelium of James and the Bible, and the argument that there were contradictions between the two, which would prove that the proto-evangelium was not scripture. Well, using these concepts from Jason Leisel's chapter, couldn't we answer these contradictions? I believe we could. And I actually happened to read the proto-evangelium of James just so I could make sure of the context and make sure that these are actually there. So I'm not an expert on the proto-evangelium. I've just read it once, but I think I've learned enough to be able to understand these. So contradiction number 1. Gabriel is called an archangel, chapter 9, verse 22, which was a common designation for Gabriel in apocryphal literature written after the 1st century. The Bible never identifies Gabriel as an archangel, but Michael is described as an archangel in Jude 1:9. The idea of Gabriel as an archangel seems to be a misconception that began in the 2nd century. Now, this would be one of those contradiction of inference. Because just because Gabriel is never said in the Bible to be an archangel doesn't mean that he's not an archangel. Just because the proto-evangelium of James calls him one doesn't mean that it's necessarily a contradiction. And this is a little bit of ad hominem, claiming that it's similar to apocryphal literature in this way. That doesn't necessarily mean it's apocryphal literature, because there are many things between these two gospels that don't contradict. We could say the same thing about Matthew and Luke, how their birth accounts are much like this apocryphal book. That must mean that they are apocryphal because they share things in common. Well, clearly not. No Christian would think so either. Number 2, Mary's response to the angel is different than what is recorded in Scripture. What, shall I conceive by the living God and bring forth as all other women do? And then in the Bible, Luke 1:34 states, Then Mary said to the angel, How can this be, since I do not know a man? Now these are basically saying the same thing. They're just saying it in a different way. We've already seen a Christian answer this type of contradiction earlier when he said, John the Baptist in one context says, I'm not fit to tie the sandals of Jesus. And another says, I'm not fit to carry his sandals. And they're just two different authors giving two different perspectives on the same thing. Neither of them is literally what was said, but they're just both the author's interpretations of what was said. And this is true here too. Number 3, Elizabeth fled the Bethlehem region with her son John the Baptist to the mountains because of Herod's wrath when he decided to kill all the baby boys around and in Bethlehem. According to the Bible, concerning John the Baptist, Luke 1:80 states, So the child grew and became strong in spirit and was in the desert till the day of his manifestation to Israel. It was Joseph, Mary, and Jesus who fled from Bethlehem because of Herod. Actually, if we're considering the massacre of the innocents described in Matthew to be true, and since Luke makes it clear that John the Baptist and Jesus were both in the womb at the same time, they would be the same age. If Herod massacred the innocents, John the Baptist would have died if he hadn't fled. So one could infer that he did, even if it didn't specifically say in the Bible. And it didn't say that he didn't. Sure, it says, so the child grew and became strong in the spirit, but it doesn't say when that started. Of course, that could have happened after they came back to Israel, which would have necessarily happened after going to Egypt. Number 4, Jesus was born in a cave outside the city of Bethlehem. According to the Bible, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the town of David. This is just dishonest. As I looked it up, it says that Jesus was born in a cave in the district of Bethlehem. I don't think that even implies that it was outside of Bethlehem. I think the author of this chapter, Bodie Hodge, who wrote about these contradictions, was just being dishonest, or he misinterpreted the proto-evangelium. Rationally, I can say that's not a contradiction. It doesn't appear to be one. Number 5, the angel of the Lord, when speaking to Joseph in a dream, said to take Mary, but does not mention having her as a wife. The priest chastised Joseph and accused him for taking Mary as a wife secretly. By the priest, Joseph takes her home, but is reluctant to call her his wife when they go to Bethlehem. In the Bible, Matthew 1:19 reveals that Joseph was already Mary's husband when they were betrothed before the angel visited him in a dream. Matthew 1:24 points out that after the angel visited Joseph, he kept her as his wife. I couldn't think of a contradiction to this. Putting my own brain power behind it couldn't. So I'm going to give the answer that I've heard many irrational Christians give when they can't answer a contradiction. They say, the Bible is true, it contains no mistakes. Even if we can't see how they don't contradict, it must not contradict. Begging the question, but I hear it all the time. So I'm going to apply that here. But that does seem to be, to my rational thinking, a good contradiction. Number 6, Mary wrapped Jesus in swaddling cloths and hid him in a manger in the inn to keep him from massacre by Herod's men. In the Bible, Joseph and Mary were warned by Herod's plot by an angel, and they fled to Egypt. This would be another one of those contradictions of inference. It's not necessarily that they happened at the same time. They could have hid him from Herod's men and then fled to Egypt. No reason they couldn't. Number 7, wise men came to Bethlehem and inquired of Herod where the child was born. In the Bible, wise men came to Jerusalem to inquire where the child king was. And again, it could just be context or inference. It could be that they did both. Why not? one after another, and it just told different accounts in different books. Now, of course, I'm not trying to be honest when I bring up these rationalizations for the contradiction. I'm trying to play the devil's advocate here, showing you how a Christian could rationalize them. I think that Bodhi Hodge, when he was pointing out those contradictions, was biased against the Proto-Evangelium and didn't even try to think, how might these not be contradictory? He was doing what most of us from an objective point of view would do and say, well, these don't look like they're both divinely inspired. They don't appear to be the same source, whether that source is true or God speaking into the author's ears and saying, this is how the story should go. So anyway, clearly there are contradictions in the Bible. Clearly the reason that they can't see these contradictions is because of bias. If they're talking about something that they don't have to justify as being contextually the same, they won't, and they don't. But if they do, then they will argue to the last, even if it's something that they wouldn't normally in a non-biblical context see as non-contradictory. So anyway, that's what I have on this chapter, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you'll check out the Skeptic's Annotated Bible. I know I keep pimping it on this like as if I have some sort of financial interest. I don't. I just think it's such a great resource. I think that if you can't come up with an answer for a Christian, you can find one on the Skeptic's Annotated Bible. And I would encourage you to use that example of the resurrection accounts to show out the contradictions in the Bible, because practically everything from those accounts, since they are covered in all four Gospels and they all four want to make different points, they have so much not in common. They have so many differences. It's so easy to find many, many contradictions in there. So I hope you will. And I hope you enjoyed this. Share, subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next video. Peace out.